All right, today we will be covering the nervous system. We'll start with the spinal cord. And when you get into your course materials, you'll click on the exam for information. Before we get to that, I just want to point out on the left-hand side here, where it says online exams, this is where you'll be clicking on to take your final exam. You'll see when you click on online exams, you'll see the neuro exam here. It's not set to open until December 15th. And for this section, it opens up at 11:30. There's another section that will open up at 2:30. So let's go back to, and also for this examination, it will be similar to all other exams with one major difference. There are 50 questions, just like there has always been. The difference is on this exam, there'll be 2 questions on one picture. Okay, so in essence, instead of advancing 50 times to 50 different pictures, there'll only be 25 pictures. And there'll be a and B for each one. Okay, so if you get to the first question, there'll be something labeled A and something labeled B, and a question associated with it, or there'll be question A and it may say identify number 32 in the picture, and then you'll find number 32 in the picture because maybe 32 is on the model and you can clearly identify that. All right, so that is the only difference. Again, 25 stations or 25 separate pictures, and there are 2 questions per picture. That's the only difference. Okay, so let's click on exam 4. And what I want you to see here is that this video right here is a very nice neuro final review. It shouldn't really just say review, it's just a great video that puts the spinal cord, the reflex arc, the brain, the ventricles, the eye, the ear, basically everything and the majority of the models in about 50 minutes. I think it may be around 49 minutes or so. Then there's a video on the brain and the neuron. This one gives you a very, very nice understanding of the different parts of the brain, the different lobes of the brain, cranial nerves, their names, their numbers by Roman numeral, as well as the neuron. And I would highly suggest reviewing this before next week's lecture. In fact, you can watch both of these if you'd like. This video here is just the instructions for the last exam, which I pretty much went over. There's nothing new here, but if you want to review it, again, it pretty much tells you that when your class starts, that's when the timer starts. For some reason, there are several students that got confused, and I'm not sure why there was confusion. It's been very clear that the exam starts at 11:30 and that's when the timer starts. So if you have 50 minutes to take the exam, it's not 50 minutes from the time you log in, it's 50 minutes from the start of the class. So there's been some students that have emailed me saying, Doc, look, I'm not sure, but I couldn't see the last 4 or 5 pictures on the exam and it just shut down. I'm not sure why. And when I looked at the back end analytics, it showed me what time the student started the exam, and it was 15 minutes late. So that 15 minutes lateness of logging in and starting the exam ate up into the exam time. And that's why they missed the last 4 questions or 5 questions. And that's why they just shut down. So keep in mind, it starts sharply at the beginning of your class, and then it closes at the exact time, 50 minutes later, okay? So those are the three main videos that I'd like for you to watch, which you will end up utilizing for the final exam. Then below that are the models. So here is the Neuron Model. This is just a PDF purely on the neuron. Here is the PowerPoint that one of my lectures follow on the brain and the cranial nerves. You do need to know the cranial nerves 1 through 12. You need to know them by their name and number. That's just not for lab, that will be true for lecture. So you have to review your Roman numerals and how to write 1 through 12, knowing, number 5 is the V, number 6 is a V with a 1 in front of it, 4 is a V with a 1 to the left of it, cranial nerve 10 is an X with 2 1s in front of it is a 12, right? So some of the basics to Roman numerals, you need to review those. Here is the PDF we'll look at next week on the brain. Here is the PowerPoint or PDF on the Reflex Arc Model and Spinal Nerves, which we'll cover today. And I will also cover the spinal cord model today. This PowerPoint is on the special senses. What we mean by special senses are the eyes, the ears, the nose. Those are your special senses. There will be 1 or 2 questions on the eye and a few questions on the ear. So you want to make sure that you understand those. Under videos, if you click here, these are some additional reinforcing videos. If you'd like to review them, feel free. Most of these are me, some of them are not, but they're short. If you want to look at the inner ear, it's 5 minutes, the eye, 9 minutes. So again, if I put it there, it's there as another study tool rather than students studying the same thing over and over. Sometimes seeing the same material from just a different perspective or a different view makes a world of a difference. Okay. All right, let's go back 1 page here. Okay. So I think we are ready to look at the first. We're going to look at these 12 slides on the anatomy and the spinal cord. And then I will look at these 19 slides, anatomy of the spinal nerve. Again, somewhat repetitious. And then next week, we'll look at the anatomy of the brain. Okay. All right, so let's start with the anatomy of the spinal cord. And here is the torso, and we're looking at it from the posterior. And what you'll see are in the neck, let me zoom in here, you'll see that there is a cervical enlargement. And the reason why there's an enlargement, if we look at the girth and the width of the spinal cord here in relationship to down here, it's because there are 2 plexus that exist in the neck. There's a cervical plexus and a brachial plexus. And the term plexus really means braid. Like a person that has long hair and they braid their hair, they intertwine it and they loop it 2, 3 times and they interlink it. That is a braid or a plexus. And that's what happens in the neck as well as in the lower back, where we have a few different plexus. There's the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus in the neck. And these plexus are a group of nerves. Cervical plexus goes up to feed the head, whereas the brachial plexus goes down the shoulder and innervates every muscle of the upper extremity. There are 8 pairs of cervical nerves. Now that could be a little bit tricky because there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 pairs of cervical nerve roots. And that's because the first cervical nerve root exits between the occipital bone or the occiput and the atlas or C1. Okay. As we move down, we'll see that we can zoom in and see the spinal cord here, and there are some layers that cover the spinal cord. And the outermost layer, we call these meninges, but the outermost layer is called the dura mater, and that's what looks blue here. Okay, and that's closest to the actual vertebrae. When we go a layer deep to the dura mater, there's another meningeal layer, and that's called the arachnoid mater. And then as we go a little bit deeper, we'll show you a different view where we can see the pia mater. So there are three layers of meninges: dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. From superficial to deep, it's dura, arachnoid, pia. Or from deep to superficial, closest to the spinal cord, pia mater. Superficial to that, arachnoid mater. And superficial to that, the dura mater. If you've ever heard of meningitis, when you have inflammation of those meninges, that is meningitis. In the thoracic region, there is no plexus, right? In the neck, there was a cervical plexus and brachial plexus. In the thoracic region, there is no plexus, but there are 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, and these are specifically referred to as intercostal nerves. Intercostal because they go to the intercostal muscles between the ribs. These intercostal nerves is where herpes zoster likes to hang out in here. And when your immune system becomes compromised, it'll express itself through these tiny, tiny vesicles, and we will call that shingles. It likes to follow intercostal nerves, and shingles also likes to follow dermatomes. Dermatomes is a neurological mapping of the skin. As we go down, we will see that the spinal cord tapers and comes to an end right here. You see, it looks like a cone. If we zoom in there, like an ice cream cone, it comes to a tip, to an apex. That end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris. Here is the L1 and L2 vertebrae. How do we know that? Well, here's the last rib, right? These are the ribs. So the last rib that we see here has to be the 12th rib, T12. So right below that is the first lumbar and second lumbar. And the spinal cord ends at the L1, L2 interspace. Right between the L1 and L2 vertebra is the L1, L2 interspace. That is where the spinal cord ends. That location is the conus medullaris. So the question then is, well, what's all the yellow stuff below that? Well, all the yellow stuff below that is referred to as cauda equina. Cauda equina refers to horse's tail. And if we look at that, it does look like the tail of a horse. It is neurological tissue. It's just spinal nerves. So they are lumbar and sacral nerves. It's not spinal cord, but it is referred to as the cauda equina, horse's tail. This is why many spinal taps or epidurals are done below L1 and L2, sometimes at around the L3 level, where when they inject a needle, there's no fear of actually that needle hitting the cord. So they'll do most epidurals down here lower, or spinal taps to sample cerebral spinal fluid, sometimes at the L3 level. Since we're here, you can see the sciatic nerve right there, piercing inferior to the piriformis muscle. We could see the gluteus medius muscle right here. Gluteus maximus looks like it was cut. All right, so here's just a close-up view of what we just showed you, the L1 and L2 vertebrae. Here's the conus medullaris. You can see it tapering into that cone, looks like a ice cream cone there. And then we can also get a nice look at the cauda equina, once again, the horse's tail. And all the way down here at the bottom, there's this center filament that anchors all the way down to the tip of the coccyx, and that is called the filum terminale. It is that center line that goes all the way down and anchors to the tip of the coccyx, phylum terminale. Here is the cervical enlargement. That's a close-up view of the neck. And it's a lot thicker in here because of those two plexus. These are the cervical nerves that are coming out through here. Those nerves look like the beginning of a plexus. As we look in a little bit closer, the blue is the dura mater. That's number 17, and number 16, one layer deeper, is the arachnoid matter. Now let's look at a different view of the spinal cord. So let's take a close look and understand what we have here so that we can get our anatomical reference points in terms of anterior and posterior. That's important. So we see the spinal cord, and there are some structures that are called anterior something and posterior something, or anterior horn and dorsal horns, and anterior columns and posterior columns. So in order to name them properly, we first have to be able to delineate and say, where's the front and where's the back of the spinal cord? Well, what we need to look at in this view, we see that there's a vertebra around it. Well, when we look at a vertebrae, we have a vertebral body, and we know that's anterior, and then we see a spinous process, which is posterior. So if we were to divide the spinal cord in half and draw an imaginary line through here, everything on this side would be dorsal or posterior, and then everything on this side would be ventral or anterior. That's important, not just for naming structures here, but also when we look at nerves, we have to be able to know, are they dorsal or ventral? Knowing some of your structural and bony anatomy is key. But there are some other hints that I can show you as well. So now that we know that back here is posterior, this line, vertical line, looks like it's number 23 here. That vertical line is the PMS, the posterior median sulcus. Now, if you're asked this on a test, don't put PMS, put posterior median sulcus, right? No abbreviations on a major exam. The groove that's here on the anterior side is the AMF, anterior median fissure. The anterior median fissure looks a little bit wider, right? This looks a little bit thicker as well. So that's the anterior median fissure. The posterior median sulcus is this slit. This looks like just a knife, very, very tight in here, okay? This one has a little bit more of a wider opening. So you should know those landmarks. Let's look at the next slide. This is a great slide because now we're looking at the three meninges, the pia mater, arachnoid mater, and dura mater. So here is the spinal cord. And when we look at the spinal cord, we said that the layer that is closest to the cord itself is the pia mater. That's this layer going all the way around, okay? Number 16, if we zoom in here, it looks like a number 16, and then we have a number 9. So these are the other two meninges. Number 9 is the external one, that's the dura mater, and number 16 is the middle one, it's the arachnoid. So you have PAD, you have pad, from deep to superficial, pia, arachnoid, dura. Pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater. This line, you could see, is the space that's separating those two meninges. Okay, dura mater, the most external one. Don't confuse it and think it's number 5. When I say it's the most external, no. Number 5 is a ligament, okay, as is number 6. These are both ligaments. Number 6 is a ligament that's called the posterior longitudinal ligament, PLL, posterior longitudinal ligament. And if there's a posterior longitudinal ligament, then there's probably an anterior longitudinal ligament, which is in front of the vertebral body. So this is the vertebral body. Behind it is the PLL, posterior longitudinal ligament. In front of it, it's not here, but this is where the anterior longitudinal ligament would be. And what sits here on the vertebral body is the intervertebral disc. So when you hear of someone has a herniated disc or a bulging disc, you can understand why if the disc is here and it starts to push back, it hits the PLL, and if the disc still pushes back, then it hits the meninges, and if it still pushes back, it hits the spinal cord. Ouch. If it pushes out to the side, then you start to hit spinal nerves. And when you hit a motor part of a nerve, that's where people get muscle weakness. When it pushes out and it hits the sensory part of the nerve, you get numbness and tingling and weird sensations called paresthesia. All right, so those are the three meninges. Again, pia mater, arachnoid, and dura mater. Now we have some spaces as well. There's an epidural space, subdural space, and a subarachnoid space. So between the arachnoid, number 16, and the pia, there's this large gap right here. That's called the sub, under, right? Sub is under, subarachnoid space. What flows in here is called CSF. CSF stands for cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid. It helps to cushion and support and protect the spinal cord. Okay, and there's some other functions to it. It helps to bring some electrolytes and glucose into the brain as well. Now, between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater is the subdural space, because it's under the dura, subdural space. And then above the dura mater is the epidural space, which is filled with fat and some blood vessels. This is all adipose, more cushioning. Okay. Number 5 is another ligament. It's called the ligament flavum. Ligament flavum, it means yellow ligament. So those are the spaces. The slide before did the meninges, and these are now the meningeal spaces. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the anatomy that's within the spinal cord. Now, one thing that I want to point out to you is everything on the outside is white matter. When you hear the term white matter, it means that it is myelinated. Myelin is a type of fat, type of cholesterol, a type of fat that protects and insulates the nervous system. This is all white matter on the outside, and the butterfly-looking structure, or looks like a letter H in the center, is not myelinated. And when it's not myelinated, we say it's gray matter. So gray matter is everything that looks like the butterfly. It's a darker brown color, and everything that surrounds it is white matter. Okay, that's myelinated. Myelin is important when we have a disease in which myelin is not being produced properly. We call that multiple sclerosis, MS. Multiple sclerosis is when there's a demyelinating disease where the body isn't producing the myelin to protect nerves and the spinal cord and the brain properly. All right, so now when we look at the gray matter or the butterfly, we'll see that we have some pointy, prominent structures. There's one in the back, there's one in the front, and there's one in the side. We call these horns. So we know that the spinous process is back here, so this would be the dorsal horn or posterior horn. Here's the vertebral body, so we know that this is anterior or ventral. So this is the anterior horn, aka ventral horn. On this side, this would be dorsal horn, this would be ventral horn, and on the side, lateral horn. You can see it here, number 37, lateral horn. So these horns are not myelinated. What connects the letter H here in the center This horizontal line is called the gray commissure. Gray, because we know this is all gray matter. Gray commissure. The hole right in the center is called the central canal. Central canal. This is where cerebral spinal fluid will flow after it leaves the brain and goes down the spinal cord. It doesn't only flow through here, but it flows through the central canal, the hole in the gray commissure. Again, dorsal horn or posterior horn, lateral horn, and anterior horn or ventral horn. Sensory information comes in through the back, and motor information comes out from the front. So sensory data comes in through this nerve, comes into the spinal cord right here at the dorsal horn, and then there's a lot of processing of that sensory input that comes in. And then motor information comes out from the front through these rootlets right here and goes out. Okay, sensory comes in the back and motor information comes out from the front. Okay, now what I said before was that white matter was around the outside. We covered the gray matter on the inside, that was here. Now let's look at the white matter all the way around surrounding it. So on the gray matter side, there were horns, right? Anterior horn, dorsal horn, lateral horn. On the white matter side, we have columns, not horns, but columns. On the back side, we have posterior columns. On the front, we have anterior columns. And on the side, we have lateral columns. And because they're myelinated, they're called lateral white columns. You don't have to put left or the term right if we ever ask this on an exam. I'd be happy if you just knew it was a lateral column, a dorsal column, and an anterior column. So the columns are white matter, the gray matter are horns. So if I pointed to 38, dorsal horn. If we pointed here, dorsal columns or posterior columns. If we point here, anterior horn. If we point here, anterior columns. Lateral horn, lateral columns. Anatomy of a spinal nerve. So what you heard me say before was that there's information that comes in to the dorsal horn, and then there's information that exits the anterior horn. So what information do we have, and what are the names of these nerves? So one of the other things that I want you to look at is when you look here at this spinal portion of the spinal nerve, you'll see this large nodule built in to this part of the nerve. It's swollen, right? There's no other yellow nerve that you'll see of the spinal cord that has this swollen nodule here. This is a landmark, and it's an important one in case you see a picture and it's not showing the vertebral body or it's not showing the spinous process. How would you differentiate dorsal horn from ventral horn? Well, there's other landmarks. It's this. This is referred to as the dorsal root ganglion. Now, what is a ganglion? A ganglion is really just a cluster or a group of nerve cell bodies that are organized in the peripheral nervous system, not in the central neural system. The central neural system is the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. The CNS, or the central neural system, is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Anything but the brain and the spinal cord is referred to as the peripheral neural system. Peripheral meaning outside of that. So this is the dorsal root ganglion. That's key, Because if we look at this dorsal root ganglion, which is number 19, and then we start to move proximal, now we get to a dorsal root, right? Or dorsal nerve root. This is the dorsal root ganglion. This is the dorsal root, which is carrying sensory information into the dorsal horn. So everything's dorsal that's connected to this. Dorsal root ganglion, dorsal nerve root, dorsal rootlets. See if I zoom in, they're much smaller filaments. So I just want you to make note of that, okay? Because if you look at this, it looks like, if you look at the yellow, it's showing this part and this part is the same. And there's a little bit of a differentiation that happens here. So this is the dorsal nerve root, but there's a difference in appearance between this nerve root and these smaller rootlets. So these are dorsal rootlets or posterior rootlets. Same concept then applies to the other side. So if this is the dorsal root, this is the ventral root. And the ventral root has smaller filaments called ventral rootlets, right? Rootlets, they're much thinner. And the rootlets connect to the ventral or anterior horn. So perhaps there's sensory information coming in, and then there's some processing that takes place in the gray matter. And then it says, okay, let's send out a motor command, motor information coming out here that's going to come out, and we're going to eventually send it out here, and this nerve is going to lead to your biceps and makes your biceps contract. All right, so it's kind of like a reflex. Sensory data comes in and motor information comes out. If you can mute your mic, please. Okay. Now, let's take a look and look at this spinal nerve. We see it right here, spinal nerve. If we follow that line, it's going right here to this portion. Between number 19 and between 20 and 21, this small section right here is a spinal nerve. Now, spinal nerves are considered to be mixed nerves. What do we mean by mixed? Mixed nerves means that they carry sensory information and motor information. And this is why I said if you have a disc herniation and the disc is bulging out or herniating out, and it hits and pushes against number 17, which is a motor neuron, right? It's a ventral neuron or ventral root. If this gets pinched or compressed, there's going to be motor weakness or muscle weakness. That's when muscles atrophy and they waste away. But if a disc pushes against this portion of the nerve, which is the sensory part, the dorsal root or the dorsal root ganglia, now they get sensory type of disturbances like pins and needles or numbness and tingling into their hands. So this is the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve then divides into two branches. Again, everything on this side is dorsal, right? Dorsal rootlets, dorsal root ganglia, and there is a dorsal ramus. Everything on this side is ventral, ventral horn, ventral rootlets, ventral root, and now the larger of the two is called the ventral ramus. If you look at the difference in size, the ventral ramus is much larger in diameter than the dorsal ramus. The dorsal ramus goes around and it's going to go to the muscles of the back and the skin. The ventral ramus is going to make up all of the plexus that you will learn. The cervical plexus in the neck, the brachial plexus in the neck. In the lower back, it'll make up the lumbar plexus and sacral plexus, which are all motor. They're all going to be responsible for controlling muscles. So they have a large responsibility. So these are larger. Again, spinal nerve, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus. Okay, so that looks like that's the last slide there. Let's go to this PowerPoint. It may be a little bit repetitious. There may be some double up here, but that's fine. Let's take a look. Here, we're looking at a C5 cervical vertebrae. It's the superior view, bird's eye view, looking down. This is showing, again, dorsal root, but we just made the delineation between this arrow, which is dorsal rootlets, and this arrow, which is the dorsal root. 17 right here is the ventral root, but these are ventral rootlets. This is the DRG, the dorsal root ganglia. And what we just covered before, spinal nerve. 21 is the dorsal ramus. 20 is the ventral ramus. And that's what this one shows here. Spinal nerve, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus. This looks like an identical slide. Okay, now we're moving on to the nerves and the plexi. So what you heard me mention in the opening was that in the neck, there was a cervical enlargement. The reason why the cervical enlargement existed was because of these two plexi. You had the cervical plexus, which was from C1 to C5. And then there's the brachial plexus that goes from C5 to T1. And if you look on the reading right, you'll see that it looks like a braid, right? It intertwines, it overlaps, it makes like a messy meshwork. Going down the shoulder, down the arm, all the way down into the fingers is the brachial plexus. And the cervical plexus pretty much goes up to the head and the muscles of the head and the scalp. There's one really important nerve that comes off the cervical plexus, and that's called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve comes from C3, C4, and C5. And what I like to say is that C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. That's because the diaphragm is controlled by the phrenic nerve. So if there's any lesion or damage to the levels of C3, 4, and 5, it can impair the function of the phrenic nerve, impairing the diaphragm, affecting one's breathing. We will go over some of the important nerves of the brachial plexus. But let's see what we're looking at. So this model here, we call him Flat Stanley. Okay, Flat Stanley, there's a bunch of nerves and plexi that I'll show you, okay? All right, so on Flat Stanley, up in the neck, in this region, we see a cervical plexus. That's this group of nerves. Here, we have the phrenic nerve. C3, 4, and 5 is the phrenic nerve. Going to what muscle? The diaphragm. C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. Now let's look at the brachial plexus and some of its terminal branches. The axillary nerve is important. The axillary nerve goes to the deltoid and teres minor muscle that we covered on the last exam. So if there's damage to the axillary nerve, the person may not be able to abduct or abduct their shoulder, bringing it out to the side, which is the major function of the middle deltoids. The musculocutaneous nerve goes to most of your elbow flexors, like the biceps brachii and the brachialis. Those are major elbow flexors, and that's controlled by the musculocutaneous nerve. There are three other nerves: radial, ulnar, and median nerve. The radial nerve follows the course of the radial bone, And the radial nerve has a major responsibility, and that is to extend. It is an extensor of the shoulder, an extensor of the elbow, an extensor of the wrist, an extensor of the fingers. So any muscle that has to do with extension of the shoulder, extension of the elbow, extension of the wrist, or extension of the fingers has to get its nerve supply from the radial nerve. The median nerve and the ulnar nerve deal with the flexors of the wrist and flexors of the finger, with the majority of them being innervated by the median nerve. More than 90% of the finger flexors and wrist flexors are innervated by the median nerve. The only one that gets ulnar nerve is the flexor carpi ulnaris and half of the flexor digitorum profundus. Flexor digitorum profundus has 4 tendons that come off of them. One tendon goes to the 2nd digit, the other goes to the 3rd digit, the other goes to the 4th digit, and the other goes to the 5th. So the tendons that go to the 4th and 5th digit get innervated by the ulnar nerve. Okay. All right, so up here was the cervical plexus. We saw the phrenic nerve. Now we're looking at the brachial plexus. Big difference, right? Cervical plexus goes up, brachial plexus goes down, okay? Here on the upper arm, going around to the lateral side, is the axillary nerve. That goes to the deltoid muscle. Axillary nerve goes to the deltoid and teres minor. Following, looks like a number 53 here, following the anterior part of the humerus, where the biceps brachii is and the brachialis, your elbow flexors, that's musculocutaneous nerve. Musculocutaneous. Now, when we look down the forearm, we can see one goes down the center in the middle, that's median nerve. One follows the radius, radial nerve. One follows the ulnar, which is the ulnar nerve. So you could see number 56 coming all the way down here on the ulnar side, that's ulnar nerve. And then you could see the radial nerve following the radial bone. There's the head of the radius. And right in the center between them both is the median nerve. This is the one that's involved with the carpal tunnel syndrome. And it goes to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and half of the ring finger. Remember what I said earlier was that although we had a cervical and brachial plexus in the neck, there's a lumbar and sacral plexus in the lower back, but there is no plexus in the thoracic region. There's only intercostal nerves. So here are the intercostal nerves between each rib going to the intercostal muscles. We said this is where shingles or herpes zoster likes to attack. I had a patient last week that came in with pretty severe pain below the bra strap near her left scapula, and she said it felt very bruised. It felt like a black and blue, but yet when I looked at it, there was no bruise. And when I touched it ever so lightly, she said it was super sensitive. It felt like a black and blue. So when I shined a light on that region and looked very, very close, there was a pin drop, literally the size of a pin, very small vesicle that looked like a herpes little vesicle that some people get around the lips. And that was the beginning of herpes zoster for her, or shingles, and sent her to her primary doctor, and they gave her an antiviral right away because it was shingles. And the sooner you start that antiviral, the better it is, and it really diminishes the severe pain that's accompanied by this and the blistering. When we look at the lower portion, we can see that there is a lumbar plexus, and that's from about L1 to L5 or L1 to L4 in that region. That's the group of nerves in the lower back, lumbar plexus. And there's two primary nerves that are important off of that. Looks like number 67 and 68. The one that goes in front, following the iliac fossa, where the iliacus is, that muscle, is the femoral nerve. And if you follow the femoral nerve, it goes right in front of the femur. It goes to the quadricep muscles. If we look at the obturator nerve goes along the inner brim, the inside, which goes to all of, you can see it here, it looks like 68. And then we see it come through here, through the obturator foramen. It comes down, and you could see it on here, also 68 on this side. So that goes to all of the adductors or the adductors, like the adductor longus, adductor magnus, adductor brevis, gracilis, pectineus. They're all the adductors. When we go a little bit lower, now we see another plexus here. This is the sacral plexus. And the sacral plexus has a really important nerve. It looks like it's 71 right here. And we can see that part of that nerve originates, if we follow it up, right here around the L5 region. So if you have, here's the L5 vertebra, here's the last disc, the intervertebral disc, the blue, between L5 and sacrum. When this disc bulges or herniates and pushes this way, can you understand why that's one of the triggers of something called sciatica? And here it is. Here's the sciatic nerve, 71. And if we follow it, you can see here, sciatic nerve. It's this large nerve, comes down, it goes all the way down. There it is again, number 71. It goes behind the femur, right back here. You can see it on this side. It goes all the way down. And we'll look at it again. Now on this view, we're looking at the femur in the front, because here's the kneecap, there's your patella. But on this leg, we see the patella here. So this thigh was rotated out. So you can see the foot pointing this way. So this gives us a different view of the tibia, where you can see the anterior tibia and posterior tibia. On this view, we can only see primarily anterior. So let's look at this view where you can see the sciatic nerve comes down, and right at the popliteal fossa, which is the groove behind the knee, it splits. When it splits into a common peroneal nerve, which is this, and a tibial nerve. The common peroneal nerve, which is right here, splits into a deep peroneal and a superficial peroneal. So here is the sciatic nerve, right there. You can see that it divides and splits, and one of those nerves is the posterior tibial, which stays here behind the tibia posteriorly, and then it goes underneath the foot. This one here, if we look at it here, this is going to divide into a superficial and a deep peroneal nerve. So right here, right around the head of the fibula, this is the common peroneal nerve right there, and it splits into a deep peroneal, which goes to all of your anterior compartment muscles of the leg, like tibialis anterior, extensor digitorum longus, extensor hallucis longus. So that's the deep peroneal nerve. The other one stays superficial. It's called the superficial peroneal nerve. And that too comes off the common peroneal. So right here is the common peroneal. Anything with the word common in it tells us it's going to divide. It divides into a deep peroneal, which goes to the front of the leg and all of the muscles on top of the foot. Those are dorsiflexors of the foot. And a superficial peroneal, which is sensory. When you sit with your legs crossed, your foot goes numb. That's because of the superficial peroneal nerve getting compressed. Here, from the side view, we can see the deep peroneal nerve, right? It goes to the anterior compartment muscles. Here is the posterior tibial. Goes down the back of the tibia, underneath the foot, and goes to the inner and outer part, but on the plantar surface. Okay? And I think the last thing that we need to complete here is what's called the reflex arc. The reflex arc is when, let's say you touch something hot and then your hand withdraws and it pulls away so quickly. That's called the reflex arc. And there's 5 parts to a reflex arc. Number 1, let's say you touch something here, it looks like a thumbtack, right? And it hits the receptors of the hand and you go, ouch. How do you know, ouch? Well, that receptor that's in the skin, there has to be a pain receptor. That's one part. So you have a receptor. Then you have information that goes through what type of neuron? A sensory neuron. This is a sensory neuron carrying the sensory information that the receptor picked up. That sensory information comes in. Ooh, look at that. There's the DRG, the dorsal root ganglia. It goes through the dorsal root ganglia, through the dorsal root, into the dorsal horn. This is gray matter. And then there's some sort of processing or integration of information here. That processing of the information, this is referred to as an interneuron, aka association neuron. It's an interneuron because it's in between the sensory and the motor neuron. That's why it's called an interneuron. The interneuron relays the information that it got from the sensory neuron. It sends it out through the ventral horn, gray matter, ventral horn, sends it out through the ventral root, and this is a motor neuron. And it's going to send it to its final destination called the muscle, which is the effector. So the 5 different parts to a reflex arc. Here is the reflex arc model. Here is the skin. Looks like the epidermis and the dermis. And there are certain receptors here. So the receptors picking up the sensory input. So you have the receptor. Look at the yellow. Let's follow the yellow. The yellow is called a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron goes in. This is the dorsal root ganglion. Sends the sensory neuron information. Then it ends right there in the dorsal root ganglion. I mean, my bad. It ends in the dorsal horn. Here's the dorsal root ganglion. Here's the dorsal horn. Now we have the relay man in the relay race. That's called a interneuron. Not an integrating. You should change integrating to interneuron. It's more appropriate. Interneuron or association neuron. It will relay that sensory data to this nerve that starts in the anterior horn. This is the motor neuron. That's orange. It's motor because it's going to send a motor command to the effector. In this case, the effector is a muscle. Effectors could be glands. They can send a command to an organ or a gland to tell it to do a job. All right, so the 5 parts are the receptor, 1, sensory neuron, 2, interneuron, aka association neuron, 3, motor neuron, 4, and the 5th part is the effector. Okay, let me just make sure there was nothing else I wanted to cover. Okay, we'll do that next week.